Hello again, everybody, and welcome to something weird. To be blunt, um, a lot of the content on this channel recently has been, or almost the entirety of it has been D&D related, which I absolutely love. I'm a huge D&D fan. Again, I'm running 2 different D&D campaigns and an open legend campaign right now. So 3 different campaigns. I think you can say that I've got the bug. However, I've been doing so much D&D content that I needed kind of a palate cleanser. Just something else for me to be able to kind of geek out on, and talk about that wasn't D&D for at least one video. And if what I'm about to talk about gets you guys interested, gets you guys excited, I may make more videos about this. But what I want to talk about today is music. Music has been such an incredibly large part of my life, from when I was really young all the way up to now that I'm an adult and I get to choose my own music and stuff like that. And I am, you could consider me what's called a classically trained musician, meaning I took lessons and I was taught by teachers and played in band and played in orchestras and things like that, and I learned music history and music theory and all that stuff. And so I spent a massive portion of my life involved in music, and music is still a very, very big part of my life. And something that doesn't really irk me, but it's one of the things that I enjoy talking about, simply because it's something that a lot of people don't understand, and because they don't understand it, they have a much harder time appreciating it than someone like me, who has a pretty decent understanding, not like professor level, but I have a pretty decent understanding of what is called classical music. Now, if I say the phrase classical music, it actually means something different to me and to the music community as a whole than it does to the majority of people that are listening to more popular music and stuff like that, and aren't really familiar with music history. If I actually did this, I asked a couple of people in my family, whom I will not name, so as I don't embarrass them for their lack of musical knowledge. I asked a couple of people, name me, just off the top of your head, name me a classical composer, someone who composed classical music. And I think the first answer I got was Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky, very, very famous composer from the late 19th century. He composed things like the Nutcracker Suite, all those songs that you guys know so incredibly well. He is not a classical composer in the historical sense. In the historical sense, he's not. He's actually what's called a romantic composer. He composed music during the Romantic period, and he composed music in the Romantic style, which is actually almost a contradiction in terms, which you'll figure out when I actually talk about what Romantic music was. And it's not all despite the fact that that actually is a romantic piece. They're not all about romance and love. Romantic is actually it was a period in music. It was also a period in art in general. And I'll talk about specifically what was focused on in the periods. But when most people refer to classical music, they refer to music that was written anywhere between about 1600 all the way up to the early 20th century. That's what they consider classical music. It generally, it's orchestral music. It's designed to be, played by, it can be anything as small as string quartets all the way up to very large orchestras and things like that. It's the kind of stuff that you think of John Williams as being like a modern classical music style composer, these big symphonies and things like that. And it's a misnomer, mostly because what a lot of people consider classical music is actually music that was written in what's called the Common Practice period, which again, between 1600 and roughly the turn of the 20th century, so 1900, that 300-year period is called the Common Practice period. It showed rapid change in the development of music, the fostering of music. Up until that point, a lot of music was generally either religious-based or was relatively simple. Like when we got into this Common Practice period, forms started being defined. They started using the key system key signature system that we're used to today. Things like C major, G minor, things like that. That was all kind of started at the beginning of the Common Practice period in a period of music called the Baroque period. So much happened in that 3 years in music because you had the Baroque period, which was really kind of a defining force in music, where they started going, no, this is let's really focus on this. You started having composers that's what they did for their job. You started having a lot of them did not make a lot of money. Like, these were not super rich people by any means necessary, but they studied music so much, and they all they did was compose, and that's how they made their money. Is they would sell their compositions to nobles and things like that. And it also started the practice of actually writing down music. Up until that point, music was transmitted orally. Basically, if you wanted to learn a composer's music, they had to basically stand in front of a band and go, okay, trumpets, I need you to do this. All right, and then while the trumpets are doing that, flutes, I'm going to need you to do this. And they would sing the music to the orchestra, and that's how they would learn it. Starting with the Baroque period, and that kind of time period, they started creating musical notation and all that stuff. So that whole section of music, when I first learned the intricacies of it and some of the defining features of each of the three different periods, the Common Practice period can actually be broken up into three periods. They are the Baroque period, which was roughly 1600 to about 1750-ish. None of these are like hard, like, as soon as 1750, it was like, oh yeah, new music period. All of these periods were defined much later by music historians. Johann Sebastian Bach, prolific Baroque composer, would not have called himself a Baroque composer. He was just a composer. And that's generally how periods of music and periods of arts are defined, is by people looking back and looking at, okay, well, this is where there was a major shift in the idea of art or the idea of music, so we're going to call that a separate period. But anyway, so the three periods that the Common Practice period can be broken up into are Baroque, again, 1600 to about 1750, the Classical period, so music that was actually written between 1750 and about 1820-ish. That is what classical music is. That is composers that worked during that time were classical composers. That's what they did. That's who they were. That's what actual classical music is that short little 70-year time span is the classical period of music. And then the last part of it, from 1820 to about 1900, again, roughly, was called the Romantic period of music, Romantic era music. And that's where you have people like Tchaikovsky, you've got Chopin, Berlioz, Mendelssohn, Wagner, A lot of people, you may not recognize these names, you know their music. Wagner, almost everybody that grew up watching cartoons knows Wagner, because he popularized in the Romantic period this new style of music became really popular called the grand opera. And one of the most famous grand operas was Wagner's Ring Cycle. And there is a piece of music called The Flight of the Valkyries that everybody knows because in a cartoon in like the 1950s or something, a bald guy put on a little helmet and had a spear and said, "Killed a wabbit, killed a wabbit, killed a wabbit." That is the Fight of the Valkyries. And the Ring Cycle itself, brilliant, brilliant piece of music. It's based on Norse mythology. It's just so cool. So this video is going to be me kind of gushing about these different periods of music, what makes them so unique, and giving you a couple of tips so that if you're in a store somewhere and you hear a piece of music, you can go, oh my gosh, that is probably a Baroque piece of music, or that might be a classical piece of music, or that might be a romantic piece of music. And by understanding the intricacies of them, which I'm not going to get into really detailed stuff, like this is stuff that, you know, you can have, you know, 300 and 400 level music history courses that all they do is study subsets of these periods or the work of just a single composer in these periods. So this can get very, very technical. But the stuff I'm going to talk about is more of a broad generalization. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that I love about these different periods of music. So the first one, let's start with the Baroque. If it isn't Baroque, don't fix it. Yes, I just stole a joke from Disney, and I don't care because it's a pun, and I enjoy puns. Baroque music, again, when you look at the periods of music before it, which are the medieval music and Renaissance music, you had things like Gregorian chants and things like that, but there really wasn't a whole lot of form to music. It was more of, you know, does this sound pretty? Okay, then we'll keep it. Baroque is where they started creating forms that you could follow, kind of standardizing music, and they started making it more complex. Like Gregorian chants and things like that are not incredibly complex things. They may have some really interesting harmonies and stuff like that, but the actual melodies themselves are relatively easy to understand. They're relatively slow, and they generally only have one thing going on. When you get into Baroque music, you have two like really defining features of Baroque music, and those two things are what's called counterpoint and basso continuo, which I'll cover both of those. The other thing that's really nice about all this music is the music itself is public domain, so I can play it in the video and not get copyright strikes for it. So going to Baroque, I want to play a song that you guys have probably heard over and over and over again, normally around Halloween. You have no idea what it's called. To be perfectly honest, for a long time, I didn't know what it was called. I just knew that it was Bach. And I really like Bach. I think he's done some amazing, he's one of the defining composers of the Baroque period. This first song that I'm going to play for you guys, I'm not going to play the whole thing, just because that would get a little bit monotonous, because some of these songs are very, 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 very long. Especially once we start getting to the romantic music where we're talking about like the Symphonie Fantastique is like a 30-minute long or 30 or 40-minute long symphony. You guys don't want to just sit here as I'm rocking out to, you know, a symphony. So I'm going to play little snippets that kind of illustrate the points that I'm talking about. So the first thing I want to talk about is counterpoint. Counterpoint is something that, again, was heavily developed and heavily used in the Baroque period. And you see it in everybody that composed around that time. Like I said, Bach was famous for it. Vivaldi did it. Handel did it. Trying to think. I'm reading names off of Wikipedia because I cannot remember all of these composers myself. And I'm trying to pick ones that a lot of people know. Vivaldi. Again, music geeks know Vivaldi. Everybody knows Handel, George Friedrich Handel, because he did this thing called the Messiah. And at the end of it, there is this thing called the Hallelujah Chorus, and everybody knows it. That is Handel, and it's a Baroque piece of music, and it actually fits really, really well. I'm not going to play the Hallelujah Chorus because I think this demonstrates the stuff that I'm talking about a little bit better. But anyway, so what counterpoint is it's basically two different melodic lines that are kind of fighting each other. And they work together, but they're distinctly different. So it sounds like you have almost like two different songs going at the same time. It's really, really interesting to listen to. It made for really, really enjoyable listening because there was always something going on that kind of caught your ear and would it would work its way through the entire orchestra, these little bits of counterpoint. And Bach was actually a master at taking these different counterpoints and stuff like that and like shifting them through the orchestra. So the song I'm going to play for you is called Toccata and Fugue in D minor. The actual portion I'm going to play for you is the fugue, which is based on counterpoint. A fugue is a type, a form of music, and counterpoint is featured in it very, very heavily. So you guys probably know the beginning of this. I will play you the beginning. This is the toccata of Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. And as soon as I play it, you guys will recognize it instantly. All right, so that's the toccata part, and you'll notice that again that this is actually written for organ. So unlike Bach composed so many different things. He composed stuff for single instruments. He composed stuff for full orchestras and stuff like that. This is specifically for, this was written for the organ, and so it's generally played on an organ. You can't really play it on a piano like you can an organ because for those of you who don't know, an organ is not just played with your hands. You actually have notes that you play with your feet. So people that can play computer or piano, sorry, brain not working. People that can play piano will get confused with an organ very quickly because you actually have to play some of the bass notes with your feet. Another interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize about organs is they have all these things called stops in an organ where if you look at an organ, you'll see the keys and everything that make, that seem to make sense, that look like a piano. And then on the side of the organ, you will see all of these little like things that you will randomly watch the organist pull out or push in. They're like these little knobs that they pull out and push in. An organ is designed to simulate a full orchestra. And so depending on the pipes, those stops, what they do is they open up and they close different pipe sets. And different pipe sets are meant to emulate different instruments. And so by opening and closing these different pipes, you could make it sound like different instruments were playing the different parts. And that's why you'll have multiple keyboards on organs because, the top one will have a different set of pipes that it works with and the bottom one will have another set of pipes. And depending on which stops you have open and closed, you can get these really intricate, interesting sounds out of this single massive instrument. An actual, an actual full pipe organ will take up an half, the back end of an auditorium, because you have to have bellows at the bottom that push the music through or push the air through, and then you have all these different pipes everywhere. They're really, really cool music. So I'm actually going to fast forward in the song here. That's a little bit too far. All right. To get to the fugue portion of it so I can talk about counterpoint. So this is an example of counterpoint, and it is a phenomenal example of counterpoint. So I'm going to play a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So that's the end of the toccata portion. All right, and so that's a perfect example of counterpoint. You have the melody that starts out, and then you have a secondary melody while this one is continuing to go down and start going into the more bass aspects of the organ and everything. You have this other one, and while that's happening, you have ba-dum bum bum 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 ba-da ba 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 ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so you have these two melodies that are in this particular case they're actually because that's fugue form. They're actually the same melody or very similar melodies that are just offset by a certain amount of time, and so they interweave and things like that, and it's a really, really interesting, fascinating thing to listen to. The other thing that you hear in there is very indicative of Baroque music in general, and eventually into the classical period as well, is this thing called the circle of fifths. In Western music, the space between notes can be measured in a numerical system, like ba, ba. That interval is called a third. Specifically, it's called a major third. And if you think of a major chord, you go ba, ba, ba. That is the first, the third, and the fifth. And the reason that's called a major third is because it's the third note in that key. The first note, I want to say that's G. Sorry, it's been a while since I've actually used my perfect pitch. So anyway, let's just call that a G. So in a G major chord, you would go G, A, B, C, D, ba-da. Wow. My music theory, my teachers are going to be so mad at me that I can't get a basic major chord out. Ba-da-da. Those three notes. So a fifth is the ba ba, and what happens is if you use a fifth and then the inversion of a fifth. So basically, if you did a fifth backwards, it turns into. I'm going to do this wrong. I guarantee I'm going to do this wrong. And music people, call me out in the comments if I do this wrong. The inversion of a fifth, where if I was to go from the fifth up to the first above it, it turns into a fourth. So circle of fifth, what it does is it just goes through fifths, basically, fifths and fourths, and it sounds like bum 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 bum. That's the circle of fifth. It shows circle of fifths. It shows up in Baroque music all the time. It shows up later in classical music. So yeah, that's kind of a defining feature of both of those periods of music. Um, but that counterpoint is what I wanted you guys to hear. And again, Bach does it so amazingly. He does it in so many different pieces. I have another piece, and this one is actually kind of interesting. The piece itself is called "Air in a G String," which is an arrangement of orchestral suite number 3 in D major by Bach. But it was arranged by, and I can't remember the guy's name now. I'll see if I've got it here somewhere. Air in a G string. There we go. It sounds dirty. It's not. There we go. August Wilhelm. It's an arrangement. It was done in the late 19th century, so late 1800s, and let me get back to it. It was an arrangement of orchestral suite number 3 in D major that was arranged specifically so that the first violin could play the entirety of the piece on the first string of the violin, which is the G string of the violin. That's why it's called air in a G string. Nowadays, that name means something completely different, and we're not going to go into that. But it is a brilliant example of what's called basso continuo, which basically means the bass line is always in there, and it's always it's moving everything forward. Like everything else going on in the music can just be wild, and you have this bass line that just keeps going over and over and over again. So this is a really good example of basso continuo. So you guys get the idea. When you hear the technique that they're using is called pizzicato, which on stringed instruments you've probably seen violins and everything where they're being played even down to like bass in that they're being played with a bow across the strings. When they pluck the strings, that's called pizzicato. And the bass line in that version of air in a G string is done via pizzicato. So you hear that boom, 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 boom. That is that basso continuo, where the bass is always there and it just keeps driving the melody forward, even where you have all the other instruments doing this. You know, they're doing all this floaty stuff on top, but that bass line is just there, and it keeps going over and over and over, and it's driving the music the entire time. Those are the two big indicators that you are listening to a Baroque piece of music. Is that they have that counterpoint is always in there somewhere, and that they have that basso continuo. The circle of fifths will show up a lot, but it's not 100% indicative of Baroque music. Like I said, it shows up in other periods of music as well. It shows up in modern music every so often, though not the full circle of fifths. So yeah, that was the Baroque period of music. If you enjoyed either of those two songs, like I said, both of those are Johann Sebastian Bach. And if you like that kind of music, or if you like those snippets of those songs, like I said, Toccata and Fugue in D minor is a brilliant piece of music. Air in a G string is actually a romantic interpretation of orchestral suite number 3 in D major. But it's also a very, very beautiful song that, again, you've probably heard that melody before. You just didn't realize what it was called. So yeah, if you like that kind of music, if you think that was really interesting, listen to, like I said, Johann Sebastian Bach is probably one of the most prolific composers of his time. He is still considered one of the greatest composers of all time. So check out some of his music. Like I said, Vivaldi wrote some amazing things. Handel wrote a lot of what are called oratorios. What an oratorio is you had operas were secular, oratorios were sacred, meaning they were based on some sort of religious text. Generally, they were Catholic in nature, masses, things like that. That's what Handel did. Those are the three big ones. And then there's always if you're looking for some artists that are not quite as well known, just because their music is not played over and over and over again in modern society. Jean-Baptiste Lully is one. Jean-Philippe Rameau is another one. Henry, I think it's Purcell. And Monteverdi, Claudio Monteverdi is another one. All amazing Baroque musicians. So shifting from the Baroque period, we go to the Classical period. The Classical period is interesting in the idea that the Baroque period was trying to kind of carve out, okay, this is what music is. This is what Western music is. It was coming from this era where music was taught orally. It was coming from this area where there wasn't a lot of rules or anything. So they were really trying to go, okay, let's just hammer some stuff out. Let's get some standardization here. Let's do this. The Classical period took that and ran with it. The Classical period is marked quite often by the fact that they developed a lot of forms, and the really great composers would take these forms and would use them in creative ways, but still stick to these forms. Like, in order to compose a sonata, you had to write the sonata in the exact way that it was supposed to be written. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sonatas out there that all follow the same pattern, but sound very, very differently. And I kind of liken it, since, again, I've been talking about D&D for a month. I might as well bring this back to D&D. A lot of RPG players, I have heard the argument for people that play things like GURPS or Open Legend, systems that don't have a class system in them, to where you can just take skills and kind of build a character on your own. They will feel trapped by a class system because it forces you into doing a certain thing. And I tend to argue that I like class systems and stuff like that in RPGs, not because they stifle creativity, but because they encourage it. By forcing you to fit into a mold that they've already created, they've set a pattern up for you. In order to create a unique character, you really do need to be more creative, and learning how to do things that still fit into that little mold that they gave you, but people haven't done it that way, is really creative, and to me is really rewarding. Being able to take being limited to 12 classes or something like that, and trying to make a truly unique character out of it. The limitations increase creativity, increase your they force you to kind of think outside the box, and the same can be true about the classical forms of music. The symphony, like when you hear the word symphony, a lot of you guys think of an orchestra, a symphony orchestra. Symphony itself is a form of music, and it came into prominence in the classical period of music. The probably two most famous composers in this period are Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, which everybody has heard of. They made a musical about him, and a movie and all this stuff. And there's a reason why. Mozart was a child prodigy. He wrote his first composition when he was like, I can't remember. I think it was like 7 or something like that. Like, he was incredibly young. And he was a musical prodigy. And he died penniless because of a lot of different issues. But Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, probably, again, one of the most famous composers of classical music and of music of all time. And it's because what he did was so amazing. Another really, really famous classical era musician was Beethoven. Ludwig van Beethoven, the deaf composer. A lot of people kind of focus on the fact that later in life he became deaf, which is actually not an uncommon thing for conductors and things like that to happen, because when you are right in front of an orchestra that is blasting music, especially if you're in small rehearsal halls or things like that where you don't have a giant auditorium for the music to filter out of. I know a lot of music teachers and band teachers that lose at least part of their hearing simply because they're getting hit with loud decibel music in small rooms where it's echoing all over it, and it damages their hearing. So it actually is not an incredibly strange thing for a composer to lose at least part of his hearing. The strange thing about Beethoven was that he still kept composing after he couldn't hear. And he was, again, phenomenal. So to kind of show you guys how the form can actually breed creativity instead of stifling it by forcing you to stick to a form, we're going to talk about a very specific form that was used and was very, very popular in the classical period of music, and that's what's called the sonata form. Interestingly enough, I have actually composed a sonata. I have a sonata that I wrote when I was in high school. Is it a great example of a sonata? No, it is not. Again, I wrote it in high school. I knew barely anything about music in general. I was learning music theory at the time, but I wrote a sonata. And the funny thing about it was much more romantic in style than it was classical. But so the first thing that I'm going to play for you guys is a song called, I want to see if I got the right one up here. Yes, Eine kleine Nachtmusik. Which those of you that speak German may realize that I may have just butchered the pronunciation of that. I learned how to pronounce German in college, which was a very, very long time ago. We're talking about, it's been a decade now. So my German pronunciation is very, very poor. But I believe it's eine kleine Nachtmusik. Which basically means a little night music or a little night serenade, and it is actually it is a it's a 4-movement piece of music. Movements, for those of you who don't know, in larger things like symphonies and serenades and things like that, a movement is a part of the song. The song is broken up into multiple pieces called movements. The first movement is uses the form sonata allegro. So this is a sonata form of music. The defining features of a sonata is additionally broken up into 3 parts. You have what's called the introduction, where what it does is it will introduce 1 or 2 musical themes. And musical themes are just, little snippets of music, little parts of music that they're going to play around with for the rest of the song. So they'll introduce a couple musical themes in the introduction. Then you will have a middle section called the development, where what they do is they change the key and they play around with those themes. They may change the melody a little bit. They may change the syncopation and everything like that. Like they'll just play around with those themes and try and modify them and change them a little bit. And then it will end with what's called the recapitulation, where it returns to the original key. It plays the original themes back again. So that you can get this really nice resolution at the end of the piece. So that is sonata form in its most basic. There are additions that you can add to it, like there could be little parts before the introduction that I can't remember what it's called. Let me look and see if I still have sonata form on here somewhere. Oh wait, no, the introduction. Sorry, the exposition is the first section that I mentioned. The introduction is a little starting point that generally is a little bit slower than the rest of it. It's not present in all sonata form stuff. It's exposition. Exposition is where they show, where they define the musical themes and they started, and then you go to the development and then the recapitulation, and then it can actually end with what's called a coda, which is just a little kind of stinger at the end of some extra music. So there was some variation in sonata form itself, but for the most part, you had exposition, development, recapitulation. So this is a little light night music, or a little light night serenade by Mozart. So this is the exposition. And again, you have probably heard this song before and you had no idea that it was, or this one you might actually know as Mozart because, again, he's very, very popular. All right, so that's enough there. So that is the exposition. So it introduced two major themes. You had the ba 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 ba, and then the second theme ba 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 da ba 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 ba, and then you have ba 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 ba. So those are the themes that it introduced. Now we get into the development. And I've got to get to the right spot in the music. So this will be right before the development starts. And you guys should be able to tell pretty quickly that this is the development. So anyway, that was the development. And again, you can see very clearly that they've taken the themes that were introduced in the exposition and they've modified them a little bit. They've played around with them a little bit. They changed some of the leaps where it went down, it went up. They changed the keys. Sometimes when it went up, it went down this time. They added in some different rhythms, some different melodies to kind of show that the creativity that they could have with that original theme. And then we get back to the recapitulation, which, again, very, very easy to figure out when you get to the recapitulation. So, sounds familiar, right? And that's sonata form. It's a basic ABA style form where you have, the exposition and then the development, which is a little bit different, and then a return to form with the recapitulation. So that is one sonata. And I'm going to play for you another sonata. And this one is another one that you will instantly recognize. And I'm going to, before we get too much into it, this one is by Beethoven. It is his most popular piece that he's ever written. And a lot of people that study Beethoven will actually tell you that this is not his absolute best work. It is a brilliant piece of music, but he wrote a lot of other brilliant pieces of music as well. This is just the one that's the most popular. Everybody knows this song. And it is also a sonata. It uses the exact same form that Mozart used. So I think it would be very difficult for anyone to say that these are the same song or even similar songs. They're vastly, vastly different songs, but they use the exact same form. And that's where the argument comes from, that these forms were not limiting factors. They were things that encouraged creativity. Because if you could find ways to make variations and things while sticking to this limited form, then you were a very creative person. So you know this song. I will guarantee you it's one of the most popular songs in the world. Everybody knows this song. But this is the exposition. That's the second theme. So again, we've introduced two themes already here. And that's enough right now. So again, exposition, it introduces the two themes. You have the ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, and then you have the second theme that they introduce. So that's the exposition. When we get to the development, which is, this will be right before the development. Listen to how Beethoven changes and kind of modifies and plays with the established themes that he's already been doing. Right, and so you get the idea there. Again, you hear the original themes, but he adds a twist in there, and then he starts messing around with them. You got pa 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 pa, and then he, normally in the first time those themes are introduced, it goes end, and then it starts again. In the development, it goes and it gets much more fluid, and then he starts adding even more stuff into it. It starts getting really, really interesting, and then we get to the recapitulation, which this will be just before it. I think I can get right. No, this will be just before the recapitulation. So. Return to the original key. This sounds very familiar. Then he goes into some stuff there that's still kind of development-ish and recapitulation and all that. So, so yeah, that's sonata form. And again, very, very different pieces of music. They use the exact same form. You can analyze them the exact same way. You can find the major themes and everything. You can see them developed in the development. You can see them come back in the recapitulation. But again, despite the fact that they're using the same form, they're massively different songs. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about classical music in general. Now, classical music was not just the sonata. There was tons of stuff. They started using single reed instruments a lot more. Things like the clarinet was used a lot by Mozart. Mozart liked the clarinet. And so things like that started becoming a little bit more popular, whereas in the Baroque period, they used a lot of the double-reeded instruments, or things like the bassoon, the oboe, the English horn, those things. They sound like they're whining, to be perfectly honest. It's weird to describe it. If you've ever heard an oboe or a bassoon or an English horn, they just kind of have a whine to them. They're very beautiful instruments, don't get me wrong, and they're really, really hard to play. Because I played saxophone and clarinet, which are both single reed instruments, which means the way that those instruments work is you put a reed on the mouthpiece, you blow air through it, and the reed vibrates like my hand is. And so when you're playing it, you can put your teeth on the top of the mouthpiece, because the mouthpiece will be plastic, but you have to put your lip on the bottom, because if you put your teeth on the reed, it'll vibrate your teeth out of your head, and it's really uncomfortable. So you put your lip on the reed to give it a little bit of tension to make it vibrate better. With double-reeded instruments, you have to play them like this, because you have to put your lip over your teeth, both your top and your bottom, and it's really, really weird. I got to play. I think it was in an oboe. I got to try, and my lips were buzzing for like 20 minutes afterwards, because there are these little like circular reeds. So it's like they're two reeds like pushed together like this. And so they buzz your entire mouth when they're playing. It's really, really weird. Anyway, so I got off on that. So yeah, that's classical music. Is they would stick to these forms, and the mass and requiem were another really, really popular form. You had masses in like I think Handel wrote masses. The mass as when people think of mass, they think of a Catholic service. Mass is actually a form of music as well, that is designed to be played for the Catholic service. So that was really popular then. Again, forms in general were very, very heavily emphasized in the classical area, and true classical musicians would take pride in the fact that they could be very, very creative given these kind of restraints and these forms that they had to stick to. They would take great pride in being able to do that. Then you get to the Romantic period, and the Romantic period was basically sticking it to the man. The Romantic period of music was based on breaking all the rules and doing the wrong things, and instead of using themes and showing how clever you could be by taking a theme and then modifying it 7 or 8 billion times, oh, look how creative I am, they would do these really, really long form melodies and things like that, and they broke away from traditional forms and everything like that. They did everything that they could to try and make things as different and more. There was this huge emphasis on storytelling in music, whereas music in the classical and Baroque periods was written to be to be listened to be pleasing to the ear. Romantic era music was designed to tell stories, and like I said, one of the most famous Romantic era composers was Pyotr Ilyich. Oh, I can't even say his name. It's Russian. Tchaikovsky. That's him. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. There we go. So Tchaikovsky, brilliant musician. Wrote some of the most amazing music of the Romantic period. I'm going to play you one of his songs, and I'm hoping that when listening to the song, you will hear something that you're not. You'll focus on something a little bit different. So again, music in the Romantic period was meant to tell a song. It was much more lyrical. It was much more the melodies and everything like that were much more stretched out. Again, if you think of Symphony Number 5, Beethoven's Fifth, the theme, the melody that would be repeated over and over again was ba 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 da 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 da. That was the theme, and then they just modified it a lot. But it was a couple of bars. When you listen to something like this, the melody goes for a pretty long time compared to the shorter melodies that just kept getting transformed over and over again in the classical period. So again, instead of little short snippets that were just modified and changed over and over again, you had this much longer melody line that would go on and then would get changed and things like that and go through transformation throughout the music. But again, these long, flowing melodic lines were very indicative of Romantic music in general. Another one that a lot of people know because it's from the same piece of music. I'm actually going to move forward just a little bit to kind of show something kind of interesting in here. Come on. Yes, Tchaikovsky, we know. Harp is cool. Get to the part I want to show him. All right, so the reason I wanted to let you guys listen to that was for two things. One, it's a beautiful song. Second, it really exemplifies what the Romantic period was all about. So that song is called Waltz of the Flowers, and it is a waltz. A waltz is a traditional dance. It's done in a three-step, so it's bum, bum, dum, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's actually a really fun dance. I know how to waltz, and I enjoy waltzing. It's a lot of fun. So, Waltz of the Flowers is a waltz. It is a dance. However, when you listen to it, you hear underneath everything, you hear that pizzicato boom, doom, doom, gong, doom, doom, gong, doom, doom, gong, doom, doom. And then you hear the first melody come in, bum, 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 ba, ba, da. Bum, 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 ba, da. And that kind of fits the beats. And then you get the clarinet coming in. And that melody goes over bar lines. It goes on offbeats and things like that. The exact kind of thing you don't want in a waltz. In a waltz, you really want to be able to feel the downbeat every single time, because that is a major step when you're dancing. You go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, ba da 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 da. And so he has this waltz that he puts this music in that intentionally makes it more difficult to dance to, which is the purpose of a waltz. So this, the idea of, well, I'm going to make a waltz, but I'm going to make a waltz where I put the emphasis on the second beat, and I'm going to put, melodies and things like that that run over the downbeat so that you can't hear the downbeat, which makes it significantly more difficult to dance to. So I mean, that's, the kind of things, the rebellious nature that happened in there. And that's a relatively tame version of some of the stuff. When you get into some of the more extreme composers, things like Stravinsky, who some people won't consider him a romantic composer just because his music was very, very different. But the idea behind his music was very romantic in style. It was about breaking systems. It was about rebelling against the norm. There is one of his more famous songs is called "The Rite of Spring," and one of the reasons that it's more famous now is if when you were younger, you watched Fantasia. There was a portion of the movie that had all these dinosaurs running around and all this, really percussive sounds and stuff like that. That was Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And Disney's version of it is actually not the story that Stravinsky was trying to tell. Again, romantic music, all about telling a story. If you think of spring and what happens in nature in the springtime, there is the idea of rebirth. There is the idea of new life and things like that. And animals start mating in the springtime. And so the Rite of Spring was about sex. And it was so graphic, quote unquote. This piece of music was so graphic that women were fainting when they heard the first live performances of it. It was described as smutty and disgusting because it was a song about sex. There are no words in this. Nothing like that. It is just a tone poem kind of thing. It's just a song that tells a story about sex. To give you guys an introduction to just how crazy some of these things could be. There was a romantic composer. His name was Hector Berlioz, and he wrote some amazing stuff. But his most famous piece was a piece called the Symphonie Fantastique, which was, again, it was a story told in musical form. There was no lyrics or anything to it. It was just a story told in musical form. And the story of this song, it was split into 5 movements. The whole thing is like half an hour to 45 minutes, but it's a brilliant piece of music. So the whole story of this is in the first movement, we're introduced to this musician who has this unrequited love for this woman, and the woman is represented by what's called a motif, which is this little snidbit of music, kind of like a theme in the classical period. This little snidbit of music that will return anytime the character is thinking of his unrequited love. It was this motif, and it'll show up here. Well, what happens is he becomes so distraught over this unrequited love that he takes opium and goes on kind of an acid trip. And it gets really, really weird until the 4th movement. He dreams that he is I can't remember if the story is that he actually killed the woman, or he's put on trial for something. He's found guilty, and he is to be executed for it. And so The fourth movement is called March to the Scaffold, and it starts off with him being marched to the scaffold. You could hear his footfalls in the music. And it's this really, really amazing piece. But the culmination of it, I'm going to play it for you first. Then I'm going to describe exactly what it was talking about there. Then I'm going to play it for you guys again so you can understand exactly what it was that you just listened to. So this is towards the end of the fourth movement called March to the Scaffold. And I want to see if you guys can figure out exactly what has just happened in this scene without me telling you anything. So here it is. Okay, it's a low quality recording of it, but what do you guys think just happened there? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Feel free to pause if you want to try and think about what just happened. But I did tell you, the point of the music was that he was sentenced to die, and the music, this movement is called March to the Scaffold. He was beheaded. That's what that part of the music was he was beheaded. And the most interesting part about that, and the thing that kind of blows my mind, because again, this was written in the 1800s. You don't think of really graphic kind of stuff happening then. But when you hear the music start to swell and swell and swell and da-da-da-da-da-da, then you hear that little part where he goes, ba-da, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's that motif from the first movement of his Unrequited Love. So that's him right before the end of his life thinking about his unrequited love. And then you hear this, da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. That's the guillotine coming down, chopping his head off, and his head bouncing down the stairs in musical form. Is that not crazy? And now that you guys have heard that, I'm going to play it again. No. Go back. Sorry. It's hard to use that on the program I'm using. So I'm going to play it back, listen for the guillotine falling and his head plopping down the stairs. And then after that, at the very after he's killed, the crowd cheers. So listen for it. And that's the fourth symphony, or that's the fourth movement of the symphony. That's not the final movement. Again, the character is tripping on opium. The fifth movement is him, if I remember correctly, it's him going to hell and being tormented by thoughts of his lost, of his unrequited love. It is brilliant. It is so amazing. When you listen to the whole symphony in its entirety, especially since when the symphony was played, they would hand out programs to the audience mentioning, okay, this is the story, so that people could follow along with the music and know what was going on. And it was absolutely brilliant. Again, one of the most amazing pieces of music I've had a chance to listen to, simply because, again, it's so visceral. It's so easy to see what's happening in your mind's eye. And this was another instance where the first time it was played live, you had people were complaining about it. Because, again, you hear the head plopping down the stairs. And that blows me away that this guy, who they think was probably on opium when he wrote this, wrote this incredible, just crazy, opium trip of a song. Again, that was romantic music. Was they wanted to tell stories. They wanted people to feel strong emotions and things like that, and things like that was the romantic period of music. And then after the romantic period, you start getting into what is generally referred to as the modern period right now. Again, periods of music are named well after they occur. So it will probably be another 50 some odd years before we actually name the periods of music in the 20th century. Just because, again, it's a music history thing. It's not like Mozart's like, oh, I'm a classical musician. No, it was a name given afterwards. But I hope this gives you a little bit better appreciation, first of all, for the term classical music and how varied what a lot of people consider classical music is. And hopefully this actually gets you interested in listening to Baroque music or actual classical music or romantic music, which is my personal favorite. If you enjoyed the romantic stuff, I would say my favorite composers. Obviously, Tchaikovsky is always he was one of the greatest composers of his time. Tchaikovsky is amazing, but he's very, very well known. So if you want some really, really interesting romantic music, Hector Berlioz was phenomenal. He's the one that did the Symphonie Fantastique. He was a brilliant one. Richard Wagner. He's the guy that wrote the Ring Cycle. That's where Flight of the Valkyries came from. He's a prolific one, but again, he did things like he did grand opera. Like the Ring Cycle is massive. If I remember correctly, it takes like days to perform. It took him 26 years to write it. And does it say on here? I'm trying to see if it actually gives a running. No, it doesn't actually say. Anyway, it's a massive, massive thing. It's like multiple operas put together. So Wagner's really cool. The other thing, Antonin Dvorak or Dvorak, I can never pronounce his name correctly. He wrote my favorite piece of romantic music, which is called Symphony for a New World. And he was very, just amazing, amazing, amazing composer. And that song, that symphony in itself is beautiful. I particularly enjoy the third movement, and the second movement is actually a relatively popular one because it was the main theme of it was given lyrics and used, I can't remember who used it, but they call it Going Home, Going Home, ba ba da ba ba, ba da da ba da da. That is from Symphony for a New World, is I think what it's called. I might be getting it wrong, but it's Antonin Dvorak. His name is really, really weird to spell. Antonin Leopold Dvorak, and there's no J in it. His last name is Dvorak, with a bunch of accents over it, and that's what it means, Dvorak. But anyway, you should definitely check out his stuff. You should check out Berlioz, check out some Tchaikovsky, and then some of the 20th century composers that technically were kind of romantic but aren't really considered romantic because they deviated a little bit too much from the romantic style, are things like Stravinsky, Debussy, Rachmaninoff, and my personal favorite, George Gershwin, is a prominent composer of the early 20th century. And he's amazing. I love Rhapsody in Blues, one of my favorite songs. It's not a romantic piece. It's jazz. But it's amazing. So, I hope that gives you guys a little bit better understanding of why I enjoy classical, Baroque, and Romantic music so much, why music is such a huge influence on my life. I think it's amazing. So, yeah, that's all for me today. I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye bye.